Hello and welcome dear students. Today we are going to discuss about ecological succession, types and concept of climax community. And the objectives of the present lecture are to describe various types of ecological succession, to discuss some examples of ecological succession, to highlight various models of ecological succession and to explain the concept of climax. Let me first introduce you with ecological succession. Ecological succession may be defined as the occurrence of gradual replacement of one community by another in a definite sequence over a period of time in the same area. There are different types of ecological succession and one of the types is primary succession. When an area in any of the basic environments such as terrestrial, freshwater or marine is colonized by organisms for the first time, the succession is called as primary succession. Primary succession begins on a sterile area such as newly exposed rock or sand dune where the conditions of existence may not be favorable initially. It may take hundreds of years before a climax community gets established. Another type is secondary succession, when the succession starts from previously built up substrata which was once occupied by original vegetation but later disappeared due to denudation process brought about by the action of any external force such as a sudden change in climatic factors, fire, strong wind, rain or some biotic intervention. Usually, the rate of secondary succession is faster than that of primary succession because of better nutrient and other conditions like presence of sizable banks of seeds and vegetative propagules in area previously under plant cover. Third type is that of autogenic succession. After the succession has begun, in most of the cases, it is the community itself which as a result of its reactions with the environment modifies its own environment and thus causing its own replacement by new communities. Means principal force of change comes from within the community. Another type is allogenic succession. In some cases, replacement of one community by another is largely due to forces other than the effects of communities on the environment. That is, succession is driven by forces primarily outside the community. Next one is autotrophic succession. It's characterized by early and continued dominance of autotrophic organisms such as green plants. It begins in predominantly inorganic environments and the energy flow is maintained indefinitely. There is gradual increase in the organic matter content supported by energy flow. Heterotrophic succession. It's characterized by early dominance of heterotrophic organisms such as bacteria, actinomycetes, fungi and animals. It begins in a medium which is rich in organic matter such as small areas of rivers, streams. These are polluted heavily with sewage or in small pools receiving leaf litter in large quantities. Now dear students, let us discuss something about process of succession. The process of succession involves 7 stages for its completion. It's nudation followed by invasion or migration, followed by echesis, followed by aggregation, then competition, reaction and finally stabilization. Nudation. It's the development of a bare site uninhabited by any organism. Invasion or migration. This process helps the arrival of seeds, spores or other reproductive propagules for establishment of species. Echesis. The early colonizing species proliferate abundantly through germination, growth and reproduction. This process of echesis is then followed by aggregation. Increase in population of the species which has become established in the area. Competition. The competition is usually for resources such as food, water, etc. Competition is then followed by reaction. The environmental conditions get modified by the action of species occupying the habitat. These changes subsequently trigger the displacement and replacement of one species by another. And finally, stabilization is the process by which the climax community gets established. Dear students, let us discuss some of the examples of ecological succession, and one of the examples is that of hydrosphere. Hydrosphere involves following stages. Stage 1 is that of phytoplankton stage followed by rooted submerged stage, followed by floating stage, then reed swamp stage, sage meadow stage, woodland stage and finally forest stage. Now, phytoplankton stage. This is the initial or pioneer stage of succession in which a pond and its community are converted into a land community. Phytoplanktons like some blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, green algae, Spirogyra, Edogonium, diatoms and bacteria are the pioneer colonizers. Phytoplankton stage is followed by rooted submerged stage. As a result of death and decomposition of phytoplanktons, a soft nutrient-rich mud develops at the bottom of pond. This new habitat now becomes suitable for the growth of rooted hydrophytes like Myrophyllum, Elodia, Hydrilla, Potamogeton, Vallisneria, Utricularia, etc. This new habitat now replaces these plants, giving way to another type of plants of floating types. This rooted submerged stage is now followed by floating stage. In the beginning, the submerged and floating plants grow intermingled, but very soon the submerged plants are replaced completely. The habitat becomes changed chemically as well as physically. The dead remains of plants are deposited at the bottom. Plants of this stage are Neolumbium, Trapa, Pistia, Nymphia and Limnanthemum. These species increase their number due to high availability of nutrients, and gradually their dead parts fill up the pond ecosystem, resulting in the further build-up of the substratum. This stage is then followed by reed swamp stage. This stage is also known as amphibious stage, as the plants of this community are rooted, but most parts of their shoots remain exposed to air. Species of Serpus, Typha, Sagittaria and Phragmites, etc. are chief plants of this stage. The water level is very much reduced and becomes unsuitable for growth of these amphibious species. Reed swamp stage is then followed by sedge meadow stage. Further decrease in water level changes the nature of substratum. Species of some Cyperaceae and Gramineae family such as Carex, Juncus, Cypress and Elocaris colonize the area to form marsh or swamp. Sedge meadow stage is then followed by woodland stage. In the beginning, some shrubs and later medium-sized trees form open vegetation or woodland. These plants produce more shade. They render the habitat more dry. The prominent plants of woodland community are species of Butea, Acacia, Cassia, Terminalia, Salix and Cephalanthus, etc. Woodland stage is then followed by the climax community, that is the forest stage. This is the climax community invaded by several trees. In tropical climate with heavy rainfall, they develop tropical rainforests. In temperate regions, mixed forests of Almus, Acer and Quercus are formed. Another example of ecological succession is xerosphere, which involves following stages: crustose lichen stage followed by foliose lichen stage, then moss stage followed by herb stage, followed by shrub stage and finally the climax, that is the forest stage. Crustose lichen stage. The soil is absent for the complete penetration of roots. Below-green algae and lichens are the pioneer species. In cooler climates, crustose lichens like Rhizocarpon, Rhinodina and Lecanora are the common pioneers. They produce acids which bring about weathering of rocks. The dead organic matter of algae and lichens become mixed with the small particles of rocks to form a thin layer of moist soil on the rocks. Crustose lichen stage is then followed by foliose lichen stage. They appear on the substratum partially built up by the crustose lichens. It includes species of Parmelia, Dermatocarpon, which have large leaf-like thalli. They can absorb and retain more water. Presence of foliose lichens not only adds organic matter but accumulates dust particles and thus help in the creation of humus. Foliose lichen stage is then followed by moss stage. The development of thin humus-rich soil layer on rock surface, especially in the crevices, favors the growth of certain xerophytic mosses such as Gremia, Tortula, Polytrichum, Bryum, Barbula and Funaria. Due to their death and decay, there is further addition of organic matter in the soil. The richness of the soil layer now increases. Moss stage is then followed by herb stage. Due to the extensive growth of mosses, more soil accumulates. Minerals are added to it due to leaching. This favors the growth of some herbaceous plants like Arstedia, Festuca, Justicia, pova, solidago and tradax, etc. After their death, there is much more accumulation of humus in the soil, together with further weathering of rocks. Thus, habitat changes with decreasing xeric conditions. Herb stage is then followed by shrub stage. Due to much accumulation of soil, the habitat becomes suitable for shrubs which start migrating in the area. Species of Rus, Phytocarpus, Ziziphus and Capparis dominate this stage. The shrubs overshadow the herbaceous vegetation and produce more organic matter. These shrubs are finally replaced by trees which make up the climax community. Shrub stage is then followed by forest stage. It represents the climax community. Due to the weathering of rocks, thin layer of soil is formed which supports small trees like acacia, prosopis, bovelia, etc. Plants require high rainfall to reach climax stage. In moist and wet climates and also in temperate climates, dense climax forest is finally developed. Now, let's have a look on the models of succession. The various models of succession which have been put forth are: number 1 is initial floristic model. Second is Connell and Slater's models. Connell and Slatyer put forth 3 models of succession. They are facilitation model, also known as relay floristic model, tolerance model and inhibition model. Besides these models, some other models are as gradient in time hypothesis, vital attribute model, reductionist population approach, Markow chain hypothesis and resource ratio hypothesis. Now, initial floristic model. This school of thought holds the view that secondary succession is nothing but the expression of the life histories of the species already present at the outset. This is also called as differential longevity hypothesis. Journey and Nisbet 1973 stated that initial conditions and species composition are the critical determinants of the future development of the community. According to this model, to begin with, there are short-lived plants with high relative growth rate, herbaceous perennials, rapidly growing short-lived trees, slowly growing long-lived trees. This model holds true only for the secondary succession and not for the primary succession, in which there is no mature soil. Connell and Slater's models. Joseph Connell and Ralph Slatyer in 1977 proposed 3 alternative models of succession. One is facilitation model, also called as relay floristic model. The facilitation model proposes that many species may attempt to colonize newly available space, but only certain species with particular characteristics are able to establish themselves. These species capable of colonizing new sites are called pioneer species. According to the facilitation model, pioneer species modify the environment in such a way that it becomes less suitable for themselves and more suitable for species characteristic of later successional stage. In other words, these early successional species facilitate colonization by later successional species. The second model of Connell and Slater's is that of tolerance model. Tolerance model differs from the facilitation model in the following ways. First, the initial stages of colonization are not limited to a few pioneer species. Juveniles of species dominating at climax can be present from the earliest stages of succession. Second, species colonizing early in succession do not facilitate colonization by species characteristic of later successional stages. They do not modify the environment in a way that makes it more suitable for later successional species. Later successional species are simply those tolerant of environmental conditions early in succession. The climax community is established when the list of tolerant species has been exhausted. Inhibition model. Like the tolerance model, the inhibition model assumes that any species that can survive in an area as an adult can colonize the area during the early stages of succession. However, the inhibition model proposes that the early occupants of an area modify the environment in a way that makes the area less suitable for both early and late successional species. Simply, early arrivals inhibit colonization by later arrivals. Later successional species can only invade an area if space is opened up by disturbance of early colonists. Gradient in time hypothesis. According to this model, succession is considered as a gradient in time. Successional sequence is a type of citrus gradient to which species are adapted. This viewpoint is reductionist and it suggests that a complete theory of vegetational succession should be sought at organismic, physiological or at cellular level and not as emergent properties of a population or community. Vital attribute model. Noble and Slatyer, 1977 and 1980, are of the opinion that certain vital attributes of a species determine its place in successional sequence. These vital attributes are mode of arrival at the site, their persistence, their ability to establish at different stages of succession. The three attributes discussed in turn can be related to duration of their dormancy in the seed bank, their age at first fruiting, and their longevity as adults. Now, reductionist population approach. Peat and Christensen, 1980, viewed succession as the population process and argued that succession is a process, rather a consequence of variation in the rates of reproduction, establishment, growth, and mortality, and is also a consequence of life history and physiological characteristics of a species. They also suggest that population processes can also influence community development and properties like species composition, diversity, productivity, and biomass. Dear students, let's discuss now the another model, that's Markow chain hypothesis. Horn stated that the explanations for ecological succession are a labored attempt to account in a biological way for something which may not have a biological cause. Horn in 1975 presented a model based on tree-by-tree replacement and concludes that several properties of succession are direct statistical consequences of a species-by-species replacement process and have no unique biological basis. According to him, stabilization is convergence of different pioneer communities to the same climax community and a return of a community to something like original if disturbed, are all functions of a Markow chain process and arise merely as a statistical necessity. Students, let us now discuss about the next model, that is resource ratio hypothesis. This model was proposed by Tillman in 1985, who was agreed to Clement's idea of replacement of communities. According to him, the resources of the habitat are regarded as the key factor. Limited resource leads to competition. Due to competition at resource ratio level, new species adapted to it succeeds. In conclusion, succession is directional and progresses towards the climax. In some cases, it may be non-directional, that it returns to a particular stage and it is cyclic. It takes hundreds and thousands of years to complete primary succession, while the secondary succession is quicker, that it may take 10 to 200 years for its completion. In some cases, the initial stage community may inhabit altogether the process of succession by allochemic inhibition of new arrivals. Let's now discuss about the concept of climax. The final or stable community in a sphere is the climax community or climatic vegetation. The annual production and use of energy is balanced in such a community. If succession is allowed to progress without disturbance, a stage is reached when no more improvement is possible in the soil and the vegetation. At that stage, the vegetation is in equilibrium with the environment and stays unchanged indefinitely by reproducing itself. There are following three theoretical approaches to the climax. Number one is Monoclimax theory. Monoclimax theory was proposed by Frederick Clements in 1916. According to this theory, there is only one true climax community in a climatic region or in a geographical area. All other communities which are present in the area in addition to climax community are regarded as subordinate communities, which are further recognized as subclimax, disclimax, preclimax, postclimax, and so on. Second is Polyclimax theory. This theory was proposed by Tansley. This theory considers that the climax vegetation of region consists of not just one type but a mosaic of vegetational climaxes controlled by soil moisture, soil nutrients, topography, soil exposure, fire and animal activity. This theory argues that climate is only one of the several characters. As there are several environmental factors, many climax communities are established. Third one is climax pattern hypothesis. This theory was developed by Whittaker, McIntosh and Slag in 1953. According to this theory, the composition, species structure and balance of a climax community of an area are determined by the total environmental factors of the area in which it exists and not by one aspect like climate alone. Fourth one is information theory. This theory was proposed by Leith, Odom and Goley. This theory considered succession and climax in terms of ecosystem development. In autotrophic succession, diversity of species tends to increase with an increase in organic matter content and biomass supported by the available energy. Thus, in a climax community, the available energy and biomass, which is called information content, increases. In contrast to it, in a heterotrophic succession occurs a gradual depletion of energy because the rates of respiration always exceed production rates. Finally, succession reaches a stage, the climax stage, when the amount of energy and the nutrients received from the environment by the plants is again returned in more or less similar amount to the environment by decomposition through heterotrophs. Dear students, with this we conclude our today's topic where we discussed about ecological succession, about the types of succession and the concept of climax community. Thank you.